Not a single person from my family came to my husband's funeral. Not my parents, not even my best friend. They all chose my sister's engagement instead. I stood there alone as the casket was lowered, realizing exactly where I stood in their world. Then suddenly, my phone lit up, a message from my mother saying, "We need to talk." Now. Within seconds, it was followed by 36 missed calls, one after another. Something had changed, something big enough to make them panic. And for the first time, they were the ones desperate to reach me. Standing before a sea of empty wooden chairs, I realized that the silence of the funeral was louder than any eulogy could ever be. I was 32 years old, a widow named Cassandra Mitchell, and the people who had spent a lifetime claiming to love me were nowhere to be found. My parents were absent, and Stephanie, the woman I had called my best friend since we were children, was a ghost. They had all promised to stand by me in sickness and in health, yet when those sacred vows were actually put to the test, they vanished like mist. The revelation of that day shattered every illusion I held about family, loyalty, and the true, gritty nature of love. My life with Bobby began 5 years ago in a bustling downtown coffee shop. I was a young nurse, coming off a grueling double shift and running on nothing but adrenaline and caffeine, when I collided with a man who would become my entire world. My latte ended up all over his expensive-looking jacket, but instead of the frustration I expected, Bobby just laughed. He told me it was one way to stay warm on a cold morning, his brown eyes crinkling with a kindness that stopped me in my tracks. He had a way of finding the light in any situation, a trait that would eventually become our lifeline. Against my own exhausted judgment, I gave him my number, drawn to a warmth I couldn't yet explain. Our first date at a small Italian restaurant felt like coming home. Bobby spoke with a quiet passion about his work as a firefighter, a dream he'd held since he was a young boy watching trucks race past his window. I told him about the ICU and my journey into nursing. We were both dedicated to service, a shared bond that anchored our relationship from the very start. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Bobby didn't have much in the way of material wealth, but when he proposed on our favorite hiking trail with his grandmother's simple solitaire ring, he offered me everything he was. To me, that was more than enough. My parents, however, didn't see the value in a man who didn't come with a prestigious title. When I shared the news, my mother's first concern was his salary, her voice dripping with that familiar, cold disapproval. My father was even more blunt, suggesting I could do better than a man in a blue-collar profession. They wanted a doctor or a lawyer, someone to bolster their social standing, but they didn't understand that Bobby gave me the unconditional support they never could. He was my loudest cheerleader, bringing me dinner during late-night study sessions and making me laugh when the stress of the hospital felt like too much to bear. Even Stephanie, my maid of honor, couldn't hide her subtle judgments. She marveled that I chose a modest wedding venue instead of the extravagant affair my parents would have funded. She didn't realize that Bobby and I wanted a life that reflected our hearts, not a social statement for the neighbors. We bought a fixer-upper craftsman house, a place with a wide front porch where Bobby promised we would grow old together, watching the world change from our rocking chairs. We spent our weekends painting and refinishing floors, building a home with our own 4 hands. We talked about children and a future that felt limitless. For 2 years, our life was a beautiful rhythm of shared stories and quiet evenings. We understood the weight of each other's jobs, the long hours, and the emotional burden of the lives we touched. My parents remained distant and formal, and Stephanie continued to make biting remarks about our lifestyle, but we were happy. Then, the headaches started. Bobby, always the one to downplay his own pain to protect me, dismissed them as stress. But then came the slurred phone call from the firehouse. He told me he felt off and was coming home early. For a man who never missed a shift, I knew the foundation of our world was cracking. The day he finally saw a doctor was the last normal day of my life. I was at work, organizing medications, when Captain Miller called to tell me Bobby had collapsed. I don't remember the drive to Mercy General, I only remember sprinting through the ER doors in my scrubs, desperate for any news. Stephanie called back quickly, promising to be there, but my parents sent a text saying they were busy with a dinner engagement. When the neurologist finally emerged, her face carried the weight of a death sentence. It was glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4. Terminal. We were looking at 12 to 15 months. The room tilted on its axis. We had spent more time picking out kitchen tiles than the doctor was giving us for the rest of our lives. As I collapsed into a chair, Stephanie's arm around me felt like a hollow gesture. Bobby, however, met the news with the same bravery he brought to every fire. Even with surgical staples in his head, he tried to comfort me, calling me beautiful and promising we would fight. The months that followed were a chaotic blur of chemotherapy, radiation, and experimental treatments. Bobby approached every appointment with a focused determination that left his medical team in awe. Initially, Stephanie was there, filling our freezer with meals and sitting with Bobby so I could rest. She told me it was what best friends did, and I believed her. My parents made one uncomfortable visit, my mother visibly recoiling at Bobby's scars, while my father immediately pivoted to the logistics of our potential financial ruin. He suggested selling the house, but Bobby, even in his weakened state, stood his ground. He had planned for our future, or so we thought. I took a leave of absence to become his full-time caregiver, transforming our living room into a medical ward. As the steroids bloated his body and the radiation stole his strength, Bobby remained the kindest soul I knew. He apologized for the indignities of his illness, while I clung to the vows of for better or for worse. The financial pressure began to mount, and when Stephanie offered a $3,000 loan, I accepted it out of sheer desperation. But as the weeks turned into months, I felt a shift. Stephanie's visits dwindled, replaced by excuses of work stress and car trouble. My parents' calls became strictly transactional. 6 months in, the tumor began to grow again. That night, as Bobby slept, I mourned the life we would never have. But a deeper betrayal was lurking. I discovered a text on Stephanie's phone from my mother, asking if she had talked to me about what they had discussed. A week later, I overheard Stephanie on the porch, talking about me in the third person, discussing plans for after Bobby's death. They were already moving on while he was still breathing. I checked our bank account and found the savings Bobby had spent years building were nearly gone. Worse, I saw a withdrawal for the exact amount Stephanie had lent us, dated the day after she gave me the money. When I confronted her about the missing funds and a disappeared benefit check, she turned it back on me, blaming my exhaustion and suggesting I was losing my mind. She even suggested putting Bobby in a facility so I could get my life back, as if he were a burden to be discarded. By the 11th month, we transitioned to home hospice. I called my family, telling them it was time for goodbyes. My father asked about life insurance before he asked how I was holding up. Stephanie made excuses and never showed. As the world outside our door moved on, Bobby pulled a lockbox from the closet. With trembling hands, he showed me that he had worked with the fire department to pay off our mortgage. He wanted me to be safe. He handed me an envelope to read after he was gone, making me promise to rebuild and find joy. He was still protecting me, even as he prepared to leave, while those who were supposed to be my blood and my best friend had already buried him in their hearts. My husband's voice was a fragile whisper, yet his words carried the weight of a mountain as he told me I was stronger than the people who were already counting his inheritance. I didn't have to ask who he meant by them. The shadow of my parents and Stephanie had been looming over his sickbed for months, like vultures waiting for a signal. In those final 48 hours, the world narrowed down to the two of us and the small, sacred moments that make up a lifetime. I played our wedding music and recounted the stories of our happiest days, while his brothers from the firehouse came in pairs to say their silent, tearful goodbyes. Bobby slipped away at sunrise on a Tuesday, his hand in mine, just as a cardinal, his favorite bird, landed on the windowsill to herald the morning. The silence that followed his last breath was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the very air in the room. When I called my parents and Stephanie, their reactions were chillingly synchronized. My mother's voice, though controlled, bypassed grief entirely to ask if I had contacted the life insurance company yet. Stephanie was no better, offering to help by immediately requesting the policy information. Their lack of humanity acted as a catalyst. Instead of leaning on them, I called Bobby's captain. Within 30 minutes, the kitchen table was occupied by a man who actually loved Bobby, helping me arrange a proper firefighter service at the old oak tree in Memorial Park. That evening, sitting in the deafening stillness of our home, I opened the final envelope Bobby had prepared. His handwriting was steady, a final act of protection from beyond the veil. He confessed that he had overheard my mother and Stephanie discussing his death benefits while he was still fighting for his life. He had seen Stephanie rifling through our private financial files and witnessed her stealing cash from his desk. He hadn't told me then because he didn't want to break my heart while I was already shattering, but he had spent his final months quietly outmaneuvering them. He had ensured the house was paid in full and placed his insurance into a protected trust that no one but I could touch. The documents Bobby left behind were a roadmap of betrayal. There were logs of unauthorized login attempts to our bank accounts linked to Stephanie's email and intercepted texts between her and my mother plotting how to manage the payout they assumed I would receive. Seeing the truth in black and white was like being plunged into ice water. Bobby had even kept a journal, noting how my parents called not to check on his health, but to inquire about the value of his policies. He died knowing that the people I called family were circling like scavengers, and he had used his last ounce of strength to build a fortress around me. The day of the funeral was cruelly beautiful, the kind of spring morning Bobby would have loved. I dressed in the simple black dress he always admired, wearing his wedding ring on a chain close to my heart. When the funeral director asked if any family would be riding in the car with me, the no that left my lips felt like a declaration of independence. I arrived at the park to find a sea of blue uniforms, Bobby's real family. But as the service neared, the 3 front-row chairs I had reserved for my parents and my best friend remained glaringly, offensively empty. The excuses arrived via text and voicemail at the very last second. Stephanie claimed a work emergency she couldn't escape, and my mother spun a frantic tale about car trouble on the highway. There was no real emergency, just a final, cowardly abandonment because there was no profit for them in a funeral service. Standing at the podium, looking at those 3 vacant seats, I felt the pitying gazes of the crowd. But when I spoke, my voice didn't waver. I told the gathered crowd that love isn't a feeling or a set of words, it is the act of showing up when things are hard. I looked directly at the men and women who had actually been there, ignoring the void where my blood relatives should have sat. In a twist I never expected, a man approached me after the service with Bobby's exact eyes and the same cleft in his chin. It was Jason, Bobby's estranged brother. He had seen the notice and, despite years of family silence, he had chosen to show up. Embracing a stranger who looked so much like my husband brought me to tears. When he remarked on my missing family, I told him simply that they chose not to be there. He saw the strength in me that Bobby had always talked about. We laid Bobby's ashes to rest in a simple niche with a carved firefighter emblem, a quiet conclusion to a life lived with honor. Returning to an empty house was the hardest part, but Bobby's wisdom echoed in my ears. He had once told me that some people want the wedding, but not the marriage, the celebration, but not the work of love. I realized he had been preparing me for this solitude all along. A week later, the final confrontation arrived. My parents and Stephanie appeared on my porch, faces masked in practiced sorrow, carrying a lasagna and a cheap trinket as if they hadn't left me to stand alone at my husband's grave. I let them in, not out of kindness, but because I needed to look them in the eye one last time. The charade didn't last 5 minutes. They immediately began advising me to sell the house and move back home, their eyes scanning the room like they were conducting an estate appraisal. Stephanie began talking about investment opportunities for the insurance money before the tea had even steeped. When I asked when they planned to stop lying, the room went cold. I laid out the bank records, the texts, and the proof of Stephanie's theft. The color drained from their faces, replaced quickly by a defensive, ugly anger. My father accused me of spying, and my mother had the audacity to claim Bobby was mentally incompetent when he made those records. I stood my ground, fueled by a righteous fire. I told them that Bobby was more lucid on his deathbed than they were in their greed. I revealed that he had changed his will and protected the insurance money so that not a single cent would ever reach their pockets. The mask of the concerned parents slipped entirely then. My mother spat out that I should have married a doctor instead of a mediocre firefighter, finally admitting that they saw my husband as nothing more than a financial disappointment. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I escorted them to the door and told them that the only family I had left wasn't in that room. Closing the door on their stunned faces didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for a year. The following morning, I woke up to a house that was quiet but no longer heavy. I decided to take Bobby's gift of financial security and use it to build a life of purpose. I went back to work at the ICU, surrounded by colleagues who had actually stood by me. Captain Miller and the fire station crew became my new anchor, proving that loyalty is forged in the fire, not just by birth. In the months that followed the funeral, the silence of my home was no longer a burden, but a sanctuary where the truth could finally breathe. My parents and Stephanie had retreated into the shadows of their own making, but the void they left was quickly filled by a family I hadn't realized I already had. Bobby's brothers from the firehouse became a constant, grounding presence. They didn't just offer condolences, they showed up with tool belts and lawnmowers, fixing a leaking faucet or repairing the deck railing without being asked. Captain Miller told me one evening that they had promised Bobby they would look out for me, but he added with a gruff tenderness that they would have done it anyway. I wasn't just a widow to them. I was one of their own. By midsummer, I finally felt ready to meet with Sam Wilson, the financial advisor Bobby had meticulously chosen for me. Sitting in his office, I realized the full extent of my husband's foresight. He hadn't just protected my bank account, he had provided me with a way to turn our shared tragedy into something beautiful. Together, we established a foundation in Bobby's name to provide scholarships for the children of fallen firefighters. Sam remarked that Bobby had thought of every possible detail to make my transition into this new life smoother. Even in his absence, he was still taking care of me, ensuring that his legacy of service would continue to light the way for others. As the vibrant greens of summer faded into the burnt oranges of autumn, I began the agonizing task of sorting through Bobby's belongings. It was a slow, sacred process. His favorite flannel shirt still held the faint scent of his cologne and wood smoke, and his coffee mug remained on its hook, a silent witness to our morning rituals. Some days, I could only handle one drawer before the grief pulled me under. Other days, I found myself laughing through tears at his collection of ridiculous socks or the tiny love notes he had tucked into the corners of our life. It was during this cleaning that I found a business card for Jason, his estranged brother, with a handwritten note from Bobby, "Should try again someday." Calling that number was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but Jason answered almost immediately. We met at a quiet cafe where the daylight revealed a resemblance so striking it took my breath away. He had Bobby's eyes, the same crinkles when he smiled, and that characteristic pause before he spoke. Jason confessed his deep regret over their years of silence, a rift caused by petty family disagreements after their parents passed away. He told me how much it hit him, seeing the obituary and realizing the years they could never get back. I told him about the card Bobby had kept, a bridge left open for a brother he still loved. That first coffee led to Sunday dinners with Jason's wife, Rachel, and their twin boys, who carried Bobby's mischievous smile. They folded me into their lives with a natural, effortless grace that taught me what a real family actually feels like. On the one-year anniversary of Bobby's passing, we gathered at our favorite lakeside spot to plant a young oak tree. Surrounded by Jason's family, the fire department crew, and my nursing colleagues, We placed a plaque that read, "Robert Mitchell, beloved husband, brother, friend." His love continues to grow. That evening, back at the house that now felt truly mine, I found a letter in the mail from Stephanie. The letter was a confession of greed and envy. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but admitted that losing our friendship had finally taught her the value of trust. I didn't reply, but I didn't burn it either. It was a heavy reminder of the cost of betrayal, a stark contrast to my parents, who continued to tell mutual friends that I was the one who had pushed them away in my unstable grief. I moved forward regardless, eventually volunteering at a support group for young widows. Hearing their stories reminded me that while my pain was my own, the journey of loss was a universal human experience. With the arrival of a new spring, I decided to fulfill a dream Bobby and I had whispered about during our late-night talks. I used a portion of the insurance money to buy a small cottage near the lake. I kept our main house. The walls that held our history were too precious to leave, but the cottage became my sanctuary. Sitting on the dock at dusk, watching the fireflies dance over the water, I finally whispered to the wind that I had found joy again. It wasn't the same joy I had known with him, but a new, resilient happiness that honored everything we had built together. My professional life shifted as well. I returned to nursing full-time but moved into hospice care. Having walked that path with Bobby, I found I had a unique capacity to comfort families navigating their darkest hours. My pain had been tempered into a tool for compassion. 2 years after his diagnosis, I sat on our front porch watching a summer storm roll across the horizon. The air was electric, thick with the scent of rain and possibility. The betrayal of my blood relatives and my oldest friend had been a brutal lesson, but it was a necessary one. It taught me that family isn't a matter of DNA, it's a matter of who stands beside you when the world is falling apart. Bobby had seen the truth long before I was ready to face it. His final act of protection wasn't just about money or a paid-off mortgage. It was about giving me the independence to choose my own path. He gave me the freedom to surround myself with people who valued my heart rather than my bank account. I realized then that I hadn't lost what mattered most. His love lived on in the strength I discovered within myself, the courage to stand alone, to reject conditional love, and to begin again with my head held high. If you are currently standing in the wreckage of a life you thought was permanent, I hope my story offers you a glimmer of hope. True family are the people who show up when everyone else is looking for an exit. They are the colleagues who become anchors, the estranged brothers who become lifelines, and the neighbors who care simply because you are a person in need. Bobby believed that a life well lived was measured by the love we give away freely. By his own definition, his life was a masterpiece. I still miss him every single day, but my grief has been replaced by a profound gratitude for the time we had and the lessons he left behind. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. I would love to hear about the person who showed up for you when you needed them most.